The Black Templars are now unique amongst the Marine factions for the fact that they don't get your standard Oath of Moment army rule anymore, so this does set them apart, in some ways for the better, in other ways you could argue for the worse, but they are very much a divergent chapter on the tabletop now, and so I thought it was about time that we dived into their relatively new codex, which was released a couple of months ago, and go through what new units and detachments and strats they have and see if they are any good. So first up, as we get straight into it, they do get a new army rule. This has replaced Oath of Moment. Instead of the rerolls, they get, at the start of the first battle round, to choose a vow for the battle. And this gives your units a specific buff based on which vow you've chosen. So you have the choice of Abhor the Witch, Destroy the Witch, Accept any challenge no matter the odds, Suffer not the unclean to live, and then also Uphold the honour of the Emperor. They're all quite fun and fluffy and thematic, and while some people might say they maybe aren't as strong as the Oath rerolls, they certainly can have a big impact on your overall game plan. Abhor the Witch allows you to re-roll charges against a unit which has the Psyker keyword, and you also get Precision against Psyker units, so against armies like the Tyranids or the Eldari or the Thousand Suns, this can make your units much more reliable at getting into combat, and then when they are in combat, much better at killing off those important characters that tend to be hidden inside other squads. Accept any challenge instead gives you +1 to wound if the enemy target has a toughness equal or higher than your strength, so meaning even against the toughest stuff you will be wounding on 5s at worst instead of 6s, and then even chainswords into enemy marines and that sort of toughness 4 stuff, you will now be wounding on 3s instead of 4s, which is a really nice bonus. It is melee only, but still that is a huge improvement in the output of most of your units that do want to be in combat. If you instead choose Suffer not the unclean to live, then you can charge in a turn you've fallen back, and you can also choose to pile in or consolidate towards the closest enemy unit rather than model. So it's a bit tricksy, the wording on that, but essentially what it means is you have a bit more leeway and flexibility in moving when you pile in or consolidate to tag other units or just get yourself into a better position, maybe get yourself onto an objective that your opponent thought you wouldn't be able to help set you up for a subsequent turn. So it's maybe not as flashy as some of the other ones, but it is a very good one if you are playing the objective and the sort of point scoring game. The last one, similar to that, Uphold the Honour of the Emperor. This gives your infantry units the Sticky Objectives rule, which is always a welcome buff in 40k, and it also allows you to do actions even after you've advanced. So if you are playing that mission game and you are focusing on scoring, this can be very, very good. It is arguably the least exciting of the 4, I would say, but if you are playing the game and wanting to get as many points as possible, you are playing the Black Templars, which are or can be a fast, mobile, melee-focused army. So being able to keep objectives as you move up the board and then also be able to advance and still do actions can really, really be useful in helping you score those secondaries. So yes, you do lose the rerolls, and I get that some people may not be happy about that, but these can be quite flexible as an army rule. The fact that you choose them at the start of the first battle round means you can tailor for your opponent, and you can, go for Accept any challenge if you're up against Knights or Custodes, whilst Abhor the Witch will be great, as I said, if you find yourself off against Thousand Suns or Tyranids. So it can be a very strong, flexible army rule, and as we will see in a little bit, there are still a fair few ways to get native rerolls in this codex, so the loss of Oath of Moment isn't maybe as detrimental as it may initially appear. So for me personally, I think overall this new army rule is a net positive for the Black Templars, and it makes them comparable, if not a bit better, than a standard Oath of Moment Marine army. There is of course also the Heirs of Sigismund rule, which like other divergent chapters just outlines what you can and can't do and what you can bring. So for the Black Templars, you can't bring any Psykers, you can't use the First Company Task Force detachment, and you also get your own bespoke version of various units like gladiator tanks, land raiders, repulsors, and you also cannot bring Sternguard or Terminator squads as you have your own datasheet for them. Moving on from the army rule though, there is of course the new detachments for the Templars. You get 3 in the codex, First up is the Companions of Vehemence, which brings the rule Righteous Fervour. This gives you the ability to re-roll advance and charge rolls, which is fairly nice on a melee focused army. It's again not super flashy, but getting rerolls on advance and charge rolls can help you get onto objectives more easily and also get into combat more easily. So it can be a very strong, somewhat straightforward fire and forget kind of detachment rule, which some people really do like. The enhancements equally are all fairly solid as well. Incendiary Animus starts us off for 25 points. This gives a Chaplain or a Judicia model and his unit +1 AP on their melee weapons. So turning your chainswords to -2 AP or power swords or power weapons to -3 AP is very good, and it can make even your standard Crusader squads and that sort of thing into very deadly melee units. It is a bit pricey at 25 points, but on a unit like Sword Brethren or, as I said, the Crusaders, this really can turn them into blenders. You then get another 25 point option in Merciless Denunciation. This is also put on a Chaplain or a Judicia, and it gives the bearer and his unit re-roll hit rolls in melee. So there you go, straight away you are getting some part of Oath of Moment back, and again this is just going to make your melee units hit that much harder and more effectively when they're in combat. I think generally I prefer reroll to hit than +1 AP, but both this and the prior enhancement do have a lot of use in this army, and I think either of them could be taken on a big blob being led by a Chaplain, for instance, and you will be very grateful to have that buff on your unit. At a cheaper 15 points, the Oathbound Exemplar goes on an infantry model, and you get +1 to the advance rolls for the bearer's unit, and you can also do an action if you have advanced. So +1 to the advance rolls, and then of course re-rolling them from the detachment rule means you can make a unit really quite speedy and also have quite a lot of utility as well, because of course they can now still do actions even after advancing. So this is quite a nice, useful utility enhancement to have. I like it, but I think I prefer the last option a bit more, the 20-point Zealous Vanguard. This simply gives the bearer and his unit the Scout's 6-inch rule, so getting you essentially double your movement at the very start of the game, and this can be a great way to set yourself up for some midfield objective grabbing or even a potential long bomb turn 1 charge if you were feeling risky. They're all, as I said, fairly nice enhancements I think. I think Incendiary Animus and Merciless Denunciation are both fantastic, and if you have, for instance, 2 units being led by a Chaplain or a Judicia, I would be tempted to take both of these and put 1 on each. And then I also think that Zealous Vanguard is fantastically useful, and if I was a Templars player, I would also be trying to fit that onto a unit most of the time. On the stratagem front, in another divergence from the main Marine books, there's no Armour of Contempt, which is wild and crazy, but instead you get 6 very good stratagems. Companions of Vehemence starts off with Devout Push. This strat is a fight phase one, giving an infantry unit from your army a 6-inch pile-in or consolidate rather than the usual 3 inches, so it's just generally a great way to get some more mobility out of your units when you are stuck in combat or you finished a combat. You can get onto an objective after a fight to score you more points. It is just really simple and really handy, but very powerful. The next one is Hearts Hardened to Duty. Notably, you can't use this strat on a unit as well as Devout Push unless the unit has a Chaplain or Judicia attached. And what this strat does for 1 command point is it gives an infantry unit from your army the option to consolidate and not have to end the move closer to the nearest enemy model. So potentially this can let you move off and consolidate in another direction, either into another unit or onto an objective, which is great. And if you have that Chaplain and can combo that with Devout Push, this gives you a huge threat radius where you can disrupt an enemy plan or get onto an objective that is potentially 6 inches away that your opponent didn't realize you would be able to get onto. So those 2 strats combo together are incredibly good, but you do need a Chaplain or a Judicia on the unit to use them both at the same time. For the Emperor's Honor is also 1 command point. This is also in the fight phase. It gives an infantry unit precision, so letting you get a load of attacks into a key enemy character, and a lot of your units have got a huge amount of volume. They're not necessarily always the strongest attacks, but you have got a huge amount of attacks. So being able to get all of those attacks into an important enemy character can mean that you can just drown them in weight of dice and just make them fail saves to kill them off. So this is incredibly strong to kill off those key important HQs that your opponent was trying to keep safe. Pious Enmity is yet another fight phase stratagem. This gives a Chaplain or a Judicia unit from your army reroll hit rolls of 1 and also reroll wound rolls of 1 against monsters and vehicles. So again, this is relieving some of the pain of Oath of Moment, but then also giving you another very nice boost with those wound rerolls. It makes you much scarier into monsters and vehicles specifically, and especially if you picked the Accept Any Challenge vow, you will be getting the bonus to wound as well, most likely, so you will be getting +1 to wound and also re-rolling wound rolls of 1 into those big scary monsters and vehicles, so this can be a really great strat if you've gone for that vow. For the final two, we have Heresy Begets Retribution. This is done when an enemy ends a normal, advance, or fallback move within 9 inches of a Chaplain or a Judicia unit from your army. Your unit can make a move of d6 inches, but they must end the move closer to the enemy. And you can, it specifies, end this move in combat. So you can essentially use this to deny an enemy charge if you're lucky. I mean, they don't get any bonuses like the fights first or any, strength or attack bonuses that some units get from charging in. So it is really good, and it can massively blunt an enemy Death Star that was hoping to charge into you. The last option is Dread Crusaders. This is done in the enemy charge phase. After the enemy has declared a charge, you can pick an infantry unit from your army that was the target of that charge, and the enemy unit that was charging has to take a battle shock test at -1. So this, again, doesn't seem super flashy, but this can be huge if they fail it. It means that they won't be able to use any strats on the unit that they were maybe hoping to boost their output, and also potentially it could stop them from denying you an objective. If they fail the battle shock test and they go down to OC 0, then they won't be contesting that objective. So if they were hoping to charge on and think, even if they didn't kill your unit, you would now be equaling sort of OC scores, so you wouldn't be able to then claim it and score it in your following command phase, you can now deny that. So it can be a really great way to not only keep your unit alive by stopping some scary strats going into them, but also can be very strong if you need to keep hold of an objective and your opponent is trying to deny it to you. So it's a bit risky because it's a battle shock test, it's never reliable, but this can be very strong if it does go off. So I really like this detachment. I think it's very simple, it's very straightforward, but there is a lot of hidden power, and a lot of the stuff that you have in here works very well with the Black Templars and the units that you are going to be wanting to bring. Things like Chaplains and Judicias get a lot out of this detachment, so if you want to bring a few of them and add them to units, this can make those units much better. Elsewhere though, we also have the Vindication Task Force. This one is more focused around your new ancient models and buffing units that they've joined, which can make it feel a little bit restrictive in my opinion, but to balance that out, some of the buffs are fairly good. Purge and Sanctify is your detachment rule, and this means that whenever an enemy attacks an ancient unit from your army, if it is within range of an objective and the attack is higher strength than your toughness, then the enemy attacking unit is at -1 to wound, so it gives you that semi-transhuman physiology we've seen on a few things before. The issue with this is that it is very restrictive. It's only on your Ancients units, and it's only if you are on an objective, so that really does, in my opinion, limit the usefulness of it. It is undeniably a very strong defensive buff to bring, but it's just hard to get a lot of use out of it, especially when you compare it to things like what the Dark Angels got in their new detachment, where just every infantry model gets it as long as the strength of the attack is higher than your toughness. They don't need to be on an objective, so it is just, I don't know, this just feels like a little bit too many hoops to jump through, despite it being a very good buff. You do, however, also get a nice buff to your Crusader squads, who can move towards the nearest objective with their Righteous Zeal move, rather than being forced to move towards the nearest enemy unit. So as we'll see in a bit, that is a rule that the Crusaders have after they get shot. This just gives you a bit more play around with that, so you can actually play the objective game a bit more rather than being forced towards enemy units. So it's a nice little bonus to have for the Crusader squads. I wouldn't say it's game changing or anything, and overall the detachment rule feels a little bit lackluster in my opinion. You do, however, get some fairly nice enhancements to make up for it. Imperialis of the Eternal Crusade is 15 points and goes on an ancient model. Whenever an enemy unit charges this unit, they get -2 to their charge rolls, which makes it a lot more difficult for them to make it in. It turns something like a charge from Deep Strike from a 9-inch charge to an 11-inch charge, and even just those really easy charges like 3 or 4 or 5 inches now do get a lot less reliable. So this is really good, and it can stop an enemy unit from getting into yours if you are trying to hold an objective and you don't want an enemy to try and disrupt that. Consecrating Aura is a pricier 25 points, but this one gives the bearer and his unit a 5-up invuln, which is of course amazingly good. Giving 20 Crusaders a 5-up invuln can make an almost impossible to remove blob on an objective, whilst your Sword Brethren, they will love that extra durability. It turns them essentially into Blade Guard veterans with a slightly worse invuln save, but arguably much scarier melee. Orb of the Emperor's Aegis for 10 points nets you Deep Strike for the bearer and his unit, which is really super handy as well. It can help you get a unit where the enemy isn't expecting them. Putting some Sword Brethren in the enemy back line could really scare them. Equally, putting a unit of 20 Crusaders in the enemy backfield with this could be terrifying. Yes, it might be difficult to get them all set up properly with such a big footprint, but if you can, that is a huge threat right there in the enemy lines that they are going to have to deal with, or they will face, almost 80 attacks coming into them in the next turn. Then finally, you can also take the Warden of Honor. This is 20 points. It gives a Crusade Ancient +1 to the roll on his Vengeful Exhortation rule. Essentially what that is a fight on death rule. So now for this guy's unit, it will go off on a 3+ rather than a 4+. So this I think is actually very strong. It's another ridiculously good way to deter an enemy unit from charging into you, because they will know that they're probably going to take a lot of hits back in return if you are getting fight on death on a 3+, even if they do manage to kill your unit. So this can be a really good way to keep an objective safe and make the opponent really have to second guess about charging into you. On the strat front for the Vindication task force, we again get 6 brand new ones. These are all 1 command point aside from the last one, but Refusal to Yield is first, and just as an aside, that is a massive tongue twister at the moment. It took me about 5 attempts to say that. Refusal to Yield is the first. In any phase, when an ancient model from your army is destroyed, you can use this, and then at the end of the phase, they get set back up as near as possible to where they were destroyed with their full wounds remaining. You can of course only use this once per battle per model, so you can't keep recycling an ancient, but getting an ancient back at full health can be incredibly strong. I think it would be quite cool if your ancient could then rejoin another new unit to bring your detachment buff to another unit. That would be quite a cool little caveat for them. But still, it's a really good, cheap way to get an important character back in your detachment. Litanies of Purgation is a fight phase strat. This gives a unit from your army +1 AP if they are within range of an objective. This one is just okay, in my opinion. Yes, +1 AP is nice. It's just, again, really limiting that you have to be near an objective. I don't think this would have been too bad or too overpowered if it was just +1 AP for the command point. But then if you were near an objective or on an objective, maybe it gave you +2 AP. I just think having a use for a stratagem, even when you're not near an objective, would have been quite a nice thing to have. But I mean, it's okay, +1 AP could come in handy. I just don't think it's particularly exciting. And again, there's a bit of a hoop to jump through. Spur of the Unholy gives a unit from your army ignores cover if you use this in the shooting phase, which is pretty handy for the smattering of shooting you will have. You get to maybe have an easier time shooting an enemy that's holding an objective and sitting in cover or something. You can use this in both the shooting or the fight phase though, because you also get to ignore any modifiers to your weapon or ballistic skill or your hit rolls. So for shooting, obviously no stealth or anything like that, but even in melee, if your opponent has any modifiers to your hit roll or your weapon skill, you can be ignoring that. So this can make you a lot more accurate going into the enemy at both range and in melee, and also a bit more damaging by being able to ignore cover with your shooting. It's again okay, it's not the most flashy, and your shooting isn't really the priority in this army, but again, this can be looked at to be essentially a way of giving a unit +1 to hit in melee, so it can be helpful if you are going up against a lot of stuff that does have those negative debuffs. Up next is Reclaim Our Honor. This is done in the enemy shooting or in the fight phase. After an enemy unit has destroyed an ancient model, and you can't have used Refusal to Yield on that ancient either, just as an aside. But if you use this strat, you get to pick a unit from your army that is visible to the enemy unit that killed your ancient, and your unit gets +1 to hit against that enemy unit for the rest of the battle. So getting some vengeance for you against the target that's killed your ancient, which is nice. Getting +1 to hit is really good. Again, there's just too many hoops to jump through though. It feels very restrictive. Having to essentially forego the revival strat for your ancient is really annoying. You may end up in some situations having to pick between getting your ancient back or giving a unit +1 to hit, which is just a bit feels bad for me. I don't see why you wouldn't be able to use both at the same time. To be honest, maybe lore-wise it's a bit unthematic, but I just think gameplay-wise it wouldn't have been that broken for you to be able to use both. We also have the 1 command point Recitation of the Revered, which allows an ancient unit from your army that was targeted by an enemy shooting attack to force -1 to hit rolls on that enemy unit. So potentially on an objective, you could be getting a unit that is -1 to be hit, -1 to be wounded, and also maybe having a 5-up invulnerable in this detachment. So you really can make some very tanky units when you are sat on objectives. Again, it might be a little bit annoying admittedly because it is ancient only, so this means you are not going to be able to use it on things like your tanks or your dreadnoughts, but if you have a lot of infantry units and some with ancients attached, you will get a fair bit of use from this. Lastly is the 2 command point one. This is Perfivid Iteration. I think I've said that right, but I don't actually know. Perfivid, I think so. Anyway, this is a countercharge style stratagem. It's done at the end of the enemy charge phase. You can pick a unit of yours that's within 6 inches of an enemy unit, and you can essentially charge them. It's like Heroic Intervention, but better because the enemy unit doesn't have to have had charged, so this can be a nasty surprise to throw at your opponent. It is admittedly fairly short range, only being 6 inches, but it is still very, very strong, and on a melee focused army like the Black Templars, you will love having this in your back pocket. The last of the Codex detachments is the Godhammer Assault Force, which is your all-round vehicle and transport detachment. You get to force a battle shock test on an enemy unit that you charged if your unit disembarked from a transport that turn, which is cute. It's nothing amazing, nothing reliable, but it is quite nice when it goes off. You do also get +1 to hit after disembarking. So in melee, you can disembark, charge in, potentially battle shock the enemy, but then still be hitting them with +1 to your hit rolls. So that is quite good. And on things like your Land Raiders with your Terminators can make them horrifically scary. The enhancements are mostly focused around charging and vehicles. So first up we have Paragon of Fury. This is 25 points and it gives the bearer +2 strength on his melee weapons. And if he disembarked from a transport that turn, he also gets +1 damage. So +2 strength and +1 damage, as well as +1 to hit if you need it after getting out of a transport. That means you could, in theory, have a strength 10, -3 AP, 4 damage Emperor's Champion throwing some attacks into enemy characters, which is really, really good. Battle Psalm Precentor is a cheaper 10 points. This just makes the battle shock test from your shock and awe detachment rule have to be done at -1. Again, it's cute and it does make it a bit more likely for the enemy to fail it. So if you do have a spare 10 points, it could be worth throwing onto a unit or a character that you are expecting to be charging out of transport, but even with -1 it's not the most reliable thing, so you can't really rely on that battle shock being failed. Augury Servo Host for 15 points allows you to pick an enemy unit within 12 inches of the bearer in your shooting phase, and that enemy unit can't get the benefit of cover. So using this against an entrenched unit near an objective, that can make them a bit more vulnerable to some shooting. It could be useful to maybe just get rid of a chaff screening unit so you can then potentially charge an enemy behind them or something. This really isn't an auto take by any stretch, however, and the last enhancement option, which is also 15 points, is much, much better. So this is Herald of Sacred Slaughter, and this gives the bearer, if he starts in a dedicated transport, the ability to give that transport the Scout's 9-inch rule. So getting something like a Land Raider or a Rhino or an Impulsor, a 9-inch move up the board, it is very, very good for 15 points. And honestly, I can't see why you would ever take the Servo Host over this one if you had a spare 15 points. It is just so, so useful for an army that wants to be getting up the board and moving up the board quickly and unleashing their cargo to get into melee as soon as possible. On to the enhancements for this detachment now. We begin with a Ceaseless Cause. This is done at the end of the fight phase, and it gives an infantry unit from your army a normal 6-inch move. Now, it can't embark on a transport if it disembarked one that turn, but by the looks of it, if you didn't disembark from a transport that turn, maybe you'd got out one in an earlier turn or something, you can use this strat to get back into a vehicle. So you can use this to get back into your transport and then use it in the next turn to go and jet off to some other part of the battlefield to get off and charge into some other unit. So it's a really nice, strong little extra move that you don't have to get back into a vehicle. You could just use it to get an extra bit of movement. But as long as you haven't disembarked from a transport this turn, you can, by the looks of it, use this to get back into your transport to get you around the board, or maybe even just protect you from some enemy shooting in the following turn. Uncompromising Egress allows a Land Raider unit from your army that hasn't moved in your movement phase to have a unit from your army disembark from it and be set up within 6 inches of the transport, and also they can be set up in engagement range of the enemy. So if your Land Raider is within 6 inches of an enemy unit, you can essentially just get your unit out. You don't even need to charge. They will just be set up straight into combat, which is hilariously good and very, very strong. Now, obviously, you won't get any charge bonuses or the like because you won't be charging in, but that means you can keep your unit as safe as possible right up until you are literally in combat. So this can be really, really good if you've got a unit in a Land Raider that you want to be as full strength as possible before they do reach combat. Gauntlet of the God Emperor is up next, and for 1 command point allows a vehicle unit in your army to move horizontally through terrain features, so it helps you avoid those pesky walls and other bits of terrain that your opponent might have been hiding behind or had their units behind to keep them safe. It can give you some huge mobility tricks for some of your units to put a vehicle through them and then allow your unit to get out so you can get around sort of things that were acting as defenses for your opponent and really surprise the enemy with a charge they weren't expecting. Up next, we have Focused Hatred. This is 1 command point, and in your charge phase, after you've made a charge roll for a unit that is disembarked this turn, your unit can move through models. Now, you can't end in engagement range of a unit that you haven't declared a charge against, but what this allows you to do is that if an enemy unit has got a screen or a chaff unit in front of it and you really want to get to that important enemy unit, you can declare that important unit as the target of your charge, and then you can just yeet straight past that screen and go straight into the juicy target you wanted to kill. So this is incredibly good. For just 1 command point, it gives you a great way to essentially just completely negate enemy screens and chaff units that may be trying to protect their squishier or their more important squads. The last 2 strats are Condemnatory Info Screed and Blessed Hull. The first one allows a unit from your army to reroll wound rolls of 1 if it disembarked from a transport this turn, or they get full rerolls to wound if they disembarked from a Land Raider. So Terminators and Sword Brethren and the attached characters you have to them, all those sort of things, they can be getting full rerolls to wound if they get out of a Land Raider, so they can do a huge amount of damage to most enemies. And considering after you disembark on this detachment and make a charge in, you will also be at +1 to hit, this will help you to kill just about anything in the game in a single combat phase. And then finally we have Blessed Hull. This is 2 command points, but in your opponent's shooting phase, this allows you to target a vehicle from your army and they get -1 to incoming damage from any enemy attacks. So all of those scary las cannons or missile launchers or melters or that sort of thing that can do a lot of damage into your vehicles, they will now be much less effective at slowing down your wall of metal. So it can make things like Land Raiders and Repulsors especially, it can make them exceptionally difficult to put down. So it's expensive, but if you want your vehicles alive to get your units up the board so you can disembark and charge into your opponent, this is going to be a great way to add some much needed durability to your tanks. So those are the 3 new Codex detachments. There is also the Grotmus one. I've already done a video for this and I will link it below. So we're not going to go into that in too much detail here because, as I said, I have already reviewed it and it hasn't actually changed all that much with the new Codex. Wrathful Procession is the name. It still boosts your infantry and your mounted units with a choice of litanies. It can give you some extra movement or some bonus strength or a 5-up invuln against shooting attacks. and it can still make for, in my opinion, a really quite strong melee focused list. It's got some good enhancements like Fights First from Sacred Rage, and the old classic of Armor of Contempt if you really wanted that strat back. That is still here. It definitely does have some teeth. But I think overall from the new detachments, from the new codex, I personally love Companions of Vehemence. I just love the simplicity of it. I love the fact that you want to be advancing and charging with this army, so being able to re-roll those is going to help you a lot with those units. There are some very strong enhancements, and the stratagems are all just very good at boosting the things you want to be bringing. As I said earlier, if you like the play style and the lore of Black Templars and bringing loads of chaplains and judiciaries and attaching them to units, this detachment really can boost those quite a lot. So for me, it is my favorite of the bunch. From the detachments though, let's move over to the datasheets. There are a few to cover here, with the awesome characters up first. High Marshal Helbrecht still leads the Templars. He comes in at 120 points, and he brings you, in some ways, a sort of like mini lion style profile. He's toughness 4 with 6 wounds, a 2-up save, and a 4-up invuln, so that's fairly standard, although 6 wounds is quite nice. He's actually got a somewhat decent ranged option in his gun Ferocity. It's only 2 shots, but it's strength 5, -1 AP and 2 damage, as well as having dev wounds and anti-infantry 4+. He can actually quite reliably punch into infantry, and he will, kill off a couple of Marines whenever he shoots or as the game goes on, which is certainly more than can be said for other characters in HQs that tend to just have like bolt pistols and the like. In melee, like the Lion, he has a dual profile. It's not quite as good, of course, but the Sword of the High Marshals can either throw out 12 strength 6 attacks at -3 AP and 1 damage for clearing through chaff and hordes, or 6 attacks at strength 8, -3 AP and 3 damage. So he is very, very good at chopping through gaunts and orc boys, as well as killing Marines and even Terminators and Custodes. He can do quite well into with that flat 3 damage. He does also get +1 attack and strength whenever he's leading a unit, and he does give that to his unit as well, which is a very strong buff. His High Marshal rule is also pretty fantastic. It lets you pick an enemy unit in engagement range in the fight phase, and you roll a dice. On a 2 to 3, they take D3 mortals. On a 4 to 5, they take a flat 3 mortals. And then if you roll a 6, they take a whopping D3 plus 3 mortal wounds. So he can actually kill 2 Custodian Guard before any fighting has even taken place if you're lucky. But then even on average, you are going to plink off a few wounds or maybe kill a Marine before any fighting takes place. And then with his strike profile, he will on average kill about 2 Custodes or Terminators by himself. So he, in theory, best case scenario, well, not best case scenario, because best case scenario, he could kill a knight by himself. But he could, in theory, kill off a 4-man Custodian Guard squad with average rolling on his attacks, and then also if you managed to roll a 6 on the High Marshal rule, he could kill off a 4-man Custodian Guard squad by himself in the combat phase. So he can do some really, really good damage output for his 120 points. He is just a pure melee beatstick. He can make a unit of Crusaders or Sword Brethren much scarier. Being able to give them +1 strength and attack is really nice. One thing the Crusader of Wrath rule no longer gives is crits on a 5+, but despite that being quite a significant loss, his old version of the rule just gave his unit +1 strength. Now he does give them that +1 attack. So whilst yes, you may miss the crits on 5+, getting +1 attack all the time now in those squads is at least a reasonable alternative to have. Also changing quite a bit is Chaplain Grimaldur. He is still toughness 4 with a 3-up save, 4 wounds, and he's got 3 servitors accompanying him, and they carry some fancy relics. Grimaldur himself costs you 110 points, and he's got a fairly decent output. He's got a plasma pistol, and then his own Artificer Crozius is 6 attacks at strength 6, -2 AP and 2 damage. He also gives his unit reroll hit rolls, so once again, you're not going to be feeling the loss of Oath of Moment as much, at least on his unit, and it makes that change a little bit less painful. He does also get to pick 1 relic ability in your command phase to be active until your next command phase, so he can choose from the banner of the Emperor Victorious, the column from the Major Altar, or the water from the Stoop of Elucidation, and he loses these or loses access to these as the servitors die. But what they do is the banner now gives +1 to advance and charge rolls, which makes him really, really good in the Companions of Vehemence detachment. It is a bit of a nerf from the old one, which used to give advance and charge to his unit, but still it is a nice buff to have. The column now gives him and his unit +1 toughness, so bumping them up to toughness 5. Again, it's a nice breakpoint and it does make them a bit more durable, but likewise compared to the old version, I would say it's a bit of a nerf. The old version gave his unit a 5-up feel no pain. However, while we're talking about that, worth noting that Grimaldur himself does keep his native 5-up feel no pain, so he does have a bit more protection against precision attacks, and if he is off on his own when his squad's been destroyed, he does still get that 5-up feel no pain. He just can no longer give it to his unit, so a bit of a nerf there. And then finally, the water, that actually remains the same as far as I can tell, giving him and his unit +1 AP in melee. They're all pretty good buffs. I mean, they're all perfectly fine buffs. Some boosted toughness, +1 to advance and charge rolls, +1 AP. They're all welcome, and they can make him and his unit much faster or punchier or durable. There's just a couple of things there that are a little bit of a nerf compared to the older versions of them. But I think he still has enough going for him to make him worth taking, being able to get those buffs on demand for a unit, as well as his own decent output, and especially bringing the rerolls to your hit rolls now that you've lost Oath of Moment does add a lot of value back to him. Up next is the big man himself, the Emperor's Champion. He is a character, but he is not an epic hero, so he can actually be given enhancements, at least as far as I understand it, unless that has changed very, very recently. But I think he can actually be given enhancements, which makes him really good. He comes in at a mere 90 points, and he really is just a pure melee beatstick. He's still toughness 4 with 5 wounds and a 2-up save and a 4-up invuln. He is now, however, a lone operative, but interestingly can still join unit. Obviously, he won't get the untargetable buff anymore if he's with a unit, but you can now run him competitively and viably, either with a unit of Sword Brethren or completely solo. Arguably, going around solo is actually more survivable because he can, get around the board and be essentially untargetable until he gets into position. He will almost certainly survive to reach combat if he is going around solo, which is exactly where he wants to be. So in some ways, that might be the better pick for him. The Emperor's Champion still wields the Black Sword, which is 10 attacks with the sweep profile at strength 6 -2 AP and 1 damage, but he can also strike with it, which throws out 6 attacks at strength 6 -3 AP and 3 damage, and he keeps precision on those, but he gains the anti-character 5+ rule, so now he is even more terrifying into enemy HQs, and as we will see in a sec, he can get even scarier. His Armour of Faith still gives him a once per phase ability to turn a damage to 0, so that is a lot of protection against those low volume, high damage attacks, something like a Knight's Fist. He will still die against knights very, very quickly, don't get me wrong, don't expect him to survive that, but if they only manage to get 1 hit or 1 wound through for some reason, he can turn that to a 0, which does give him a lot of potential durability against those big, scary attacks. His Sigismund's Heir ability, though, has changed quite a lot. Instead of giving the +1 to wound rolls, it now gives him and his unit +2 to charge rolls against character units, which is immediately fantastic for getting him into combat. And then once per battle, if he is in combat with a character unit, he can give his Black Sword devastating wounds. So anti-character 5+ and dev wounds, which makes him horrifically good. He will pretty reliably kill off most enemy HQs and characters. Most Marine HQs he will kill. Calgar, Azrael, Dante, he will quite reliably kill off. Even the new Logan with 8 wounds. I think from my math hammer, the Emperor's Champion did about 7.5 wounds to him, so with the use of a command point reroll or any of the other enhancements or detachment buffs or anything like that, or with just a bit of luck, he could absolutely kill Logan in a single combat phase, which for just 90 points plus any enhancement costs isn't that bad. From the main HQs, we go to the generic ones, and the Black Templars have their own version of both a captain and a lieutenant. The Marshal is your captain equivalent, and at 80 points he brings you a fairly standard toughness 4, 5 wound profile with a 3-up save and 4-up invuln. He can take a plasma pistol or a combi weapon, and he has a mastercrafted power sword or power weapon should I say, for his melee attacks. This is quite spicy actually. It goes up to 7 attacks at strength 5, -2 AP, 2 damage, and gains lethal hits, so he can be fairly good into a lot of targets, even tougher targets now. He also gives his unit critical hits on 5s in melee, so like Helbrecht gave before, so he will be getting those lethals on a 5+, and then also giving crit hits to the unit that he joined, so potentially getting you some crit 5s on lethals or sustained hits on things like your Crusaders or your Sword Brethren, as we'll see in just a bit. And then although he loses the reduced command point cost of 1 that he had before, like other Marine captains, which is admittedly a bit of a loss, he gains Pious Fervor, which allows him to add +1 to the attacks of his sword for each enemy unit within 6 inches, up to a maximum of 3. So he can go up to 10 attacks if he's completely surrounded, and then he will be fairly solid for just diving into a big scrum of enemy units, getting up to 10 attacks, and then tearing through them quite reliably with a load of attacks that can potentially be auto-wounding on 5s if he's with a unit of Crusaders or Sword Brethren. For a cheaper 60 points, the Castellan doesn't get an invulnerable save, and he only has 4 wounds, so he is quite squishy as far as Marines go. He gets to pick a chainsword or a power weapon for combat. The chainsword has 7 attacks and sustain hits 1, so really good into infantry, whilst the power weapon, like the Marshal, has lethal hits, but his only has 6 attacks. He can also join a unit already joined by a captain or a chapter master, so your Marshal or Helbrecht, for instance, and he has quite a lot of options for the units that he can actually join, from Sword Brethren to Assault Intercessors to Crusader squads. He can even join Inferno squads if you really wanted to. I'm not sure why you would, but you can. The Castellan gets to give you some command point regen on a 4+ with his prioritized eradication, which happens whenever you destroy an enemy unit in melee. And then he also gets the vehement aggression rule, so whilst he is leading a unit, whenever his unit fights, you take a leadership test. If you pass it, you get full reroll to hit, and if you fail it, you just reroll hit rolls of 1. So either way, you're getting a buff. It's just getting full rerolls if you pass the leadership test is incredibly good, especially when most of your weapons have sustained or lethal hits. That can be a huge force multiplier, and it can make your squads incredibly good for killing, whether it's infantry or vehicles or knights or anything like that. He can be a very cheap but very effective force multiplier for those squads, for things like Sword Brethren or Crusader squads. Next up, we have a couple of brand new character units for the Templars. The Execrator is a Chaplain unit who for 70 points gets you a toughness 4 wound model with a 3-up save and a 4-up invuln. He can take a Pyre pistol, or if you keep his heavy bolt pistol, or his Absolver bolt pistol, should I say, he can also take a power weapon. So he comes stock with the Crozius, and then the power weapon, if you choose it, gives him 3 extra attacks. I think that's worth it over the Pyre pistol personally. That's going to get me confused at some point. But that gives him, if you take the power sword option and keep his regular bolt pistol, 5 strength 6 attacks at -1 AP and 2 damage, and then a further 3 strength 5 attacks at -2 AP, 2 damage with lethal hits if you take the power weapon, which just to me seems infinitely better than taking a Pyre pistol. He also gives his unit advance and charge, which is incredibly good, and especially again in the Companions of Vehemence detachment with their rerolls on both of those, he can get a unit into combat incredibly quickly. And then his other rule, Condemnatory Annihilation, that forces a battle shock test on every enemy unit within 6 inches if his unit destroys an enemy unit. Now, it's a battle shock test, so yes, it's not amazing, it's not reliable, but this isn't just that you choose an enemy unit within 6 inches, it impacts every enemy unit within 6 inches. So the fact that it's like this aura ability does make it a bit better. You could, in theory, mess up a few enemy units that are around, or even just getting, maybe 1 or 2 enemy units to fail their test can make a big difference if you're lucky. So that isn't actually all that bad as far as rules go. For his cost, I do genuinely think he's pretty great. Advance and charge alone makes him well worth it in this army. His own melee output is really good. He looks cool. And then the battle shock test thing, it's not going to go off all that often, but it's just a nice extra cherry on top that you will appreciate when it does happen. The Crusade Ancient is your new Ancient model. Alongside the regular Blade Guard Ancient and the new Terminator Ancient that's coming, you can bring this guy along. He is 65 points and he's got some okay melee. He's got a power weapon, so 5 attacks, lethal hits, 2 damage, as you would expect from that sort of thing. His main use is being a buffing piece for your Crusader squads or your Sword Brethren. So as we spoke about earlier, he's got the Vengeful Exhortation rule, which gives his units fight on death. It's on a 4+ normally, but on a 3+ in the Vindication task force, and that does give him a lot of use in that detachment. But even aside from that, having Fight on Death is really useful. It's one of the better abilities to have in the game. So bringing this guy along for 65 points to give something like your Sword Brethren Fight on Death could be very well worth it, and gives them a lot of protection against being charged, because even if they all get wiped out by the enemy attacks, on average, if you bring a 10-man squad, you're getting 5 of them to fight back, and they can do a lot of damage on the return swings. He's also got Martial Honor, which gives the Ancient and his unit +5 OC after they kill an enemy unit in melee, so that can make them really good options for taking and stealing and holding objectives after they've fought something off it. So he's not bad. I do love the Fight on Death rule, as I said. He's got a pretty cool model. I think he can be worth it, especially in the Vindication task force. But if you are going up against an enemy army that has a lot of melee units that like have a big charge range, something like Blood Angels, where you are at risk of being charged before you get to charge, this can be a really good defensive unit to add in to make sure that you aren't getting wiped out and doing nothing in return. On the topic of the Sword Brethren, for a mere 105 points, you can bring 4 of them, all the way up to 260 points for a full unit of 10. So they essentially cost 26 points per model, and that gets you a toughness 4 3-up save unit with 3 wounds apiece. They are, to be fair, not as tanky as things like Blade Guard or even Inner Circle Companions, but to make up for that, they can be really quite killy. They all come with chainswords, but they can swap them all out for a master-crafted power weapon, which nets them 3 attacks each at strength 5, -2 AP, 2 damage, and lethal hits. 1 in 5 can take a Thunderhammer for those strength 8 dev wound attacks, and then 1 in 5 can also take twin lightning claws if you wanted some anti-chaff attacks. So 5 attacks at strength 5, -2 AP, 1 damage with twin linked. So they can be quite customizable, and they've got a good mix of power weapons, Thunderhammers, and lightning claws. They have lost some output compared to their index profile. The datasheet rule they have now is a lot worse. No longer do they get the option to pick either +1 attack or +1 damage in the fight phase. Now their ability just lets them make a normal move after an enemy unit has fallen back from them, which I personally think is kind of trash. Yeah, I can't imagine it being used all that often. Sometimes, yes, but compared to the index version, it is really, really bad. The good news, however, that you may have noticed earlier is that instead of just having power weapons, each Sword Brethren now gets a master crafted one, so their melee output has gone up in that regard. Previously, there were 4 attacks at strength 5, -2 AP, 1 damage. Now their power weapons are 3 attacks, strength 5, -2 AP, 2 damage, and also get lethal hits. Now, I'm not saying the change to their datasheet rule doesn't hurt, because it does. You know, it is a lot less of attacks, and you know, you can't get, you're still 2 damage base now, but you could still get to 2 damage before, so that improvement isn't always like the most noticeable. You do get lethal hits though, which is really good, and they can still be absolute blenders when you put something like a Castellan and a Marshal with them, giving them crits on 5s and full rerolls potentially from the Castellan means they will still cut through almost anything. A full unit of 10 Sword Brethren with those 2 HQs will easily one-shot an Imperial Knight in melee. The Sword Brethren alone do about 24 wounds, so then you just need the Castellan and the Marshal to finish it off and do the last couple of wounds, which they can easily do. So these guys in a full squad, yes, that is a bit pricey, but they can still be one of the most damaging units in the entire game if you set it up right. They are just a bit different in terms of how they were before, and they feel a bit worse just looking at the pure datasheet and the datasheet rule, but genuinely they are still very, very good. What the Black Templars also get is their own unique version of Sternguard and Terminators. Again, we won't dwell on these guys too much because it is mostly the same as the main Codex versions. The real changes are with some of the datasheet rules, because obviously the Sternguard and the Terminators interact in the main Codex versions with Oath of Moment, which obviously they can't do in the Black Templars. So Sternguard lose their once per game wound rerolls against their Oath target. Instead, they get Virtuous Onslaught. This gives them an always-on reroll wound rolls of 1 against the closest target. So it is less powerful because you don't get the full rerolls, and you know, generally with Sternguard you are fishing for the dev wound crits, but it is longer lasting and it could work out to be maybe more effective over the course of the entire game. But in my experience anyway, Generally with Sternguard, you just want that one turn where you go all in and just take down a key enemy unit with those wound rerolls to get as many devs as possible. So I think it's probably a bit worse in my perspective and in my opinion, but it can still make them fairly decent. And, they do still get a good bit of extra damage from their dev wounds by re-rolling wound rolls of 1. So they do still have a place. I just don't think they are as good as the main Codex version. Likewise, Terminators, they are mostly the same. They gain Judgment of the Weak, which means whenever an enemy unit falls back from them, excluding monsters and vehicles, they have to take a Desperate Escape test, and it's at -1 if the enemy unit is battle shocked. It's kind of meh. I don't think Terminators are that great with Black Templars, but equally they're not great in any chapter at the moment, really. So I don't think you're going to see these all that often. Certainly for the Templars, I would probably rather be bringing Crusader squads or Sword Brethren instead of them. On the topic of the Crusader squads, they are 150 points for 10 or 310 points for 20, because you can bring 20 of these guys, which does make them pretty cheap actually. 16 points for a toughness 4, 2 wound body. Yes, the neophytes only have a 4-up save, which is a bit flimsy, but if you want a horde of Marines on the battlefield, this is the chapter that you can do it with. You can make them incredibly melee heavy. They can all take a bolt pistol and chainsword if you wanted, aside from the sword brother who has a power weapon, but that nets you 76 attacks at strength 4, -1 AP, and their chainswords also have sustained hits 1, so they are the ultimate in infantry blenders. They can just chew through anything from Orc boys all the way up to Marines, and even Terminators and Custodians just through sheer weight of dice will fall before that many attacks. They do also get a very cool rule that we saw mentioned earlier, Righteous Zeal. This allows them to move if they have been shot and had any models destroyed. They get to roll a d6 and they move that far plus 2 inches. Now they do have to move towards the closest enemy unit, but they can move into engagement range with this. So as you are moving up the board and getting up the board as quickly as possible, if you are running sort of a big horde of these guys, you can get a lot of your units really far up the board with that potential extra 8 inches of movement, and even get yourself into combat to deny an enemy charge if you were lucky enough. So it is a very solid rule, and a full unit of 20 of these guys can, in some cases, get you a very reliable turn 2 charge, maybe even a turn 1 charge if your opponent goes first and takes some shots at you, because then you could potentially move up to 8 inches, then a further 6 inches in your movement phase, and then maybe get a charge off. The last thing to cover for the Templars are their vehicles. Again, we won't go into these in too much depth because there isn't that many changes. The Impulsor, the Gladiator tanks, the Repulsors, and the Land Raider Crusader all have their own Black Templar version. The main difference really is that they all come with a multi-melter, so it gives you essentially 2 extra strength 9 shots. The reason for that is because it's a Black Templar lore thing. They've had it since way back when. So GW just decided to keep that in their supplement, and it means that you cannot bring the generic Codex versions of those vehicles. You have to bring the Black Templar versions. There are a few other small changes on the datasheets. So the Repulsor gets stabilized disembarkation, which allows a unit to disembark from it after an enemy has shot at your Repulsor, and they can also disembark within 6 inches of it. The Executioner, instead of getting +1 to hit against targets below half strength, instead it gets reroll hit rolls against targets within 12 inches of a unit from your army. This actually I think is an improvement, and it can make the Repulsor a really quite good fire support piece. I would rather have the reroll hit rolls, especially because you don't have Oath of Moment, and the +1 to hit is only against targets below half strength for the Codex version, so I actually think this is an improvement. And then the Crusader, that gains the rule Legacy of Gerelas, which allows you in your shooting phase to pick an enemy unit hit by your Crusader's shooting, and a friendly unit that has disembarked from your Crusader that turn can reroll hit and wound rolls of 1 into that target. This can be really good if you disembark something like a unit of Sword Brethren. They will be getting a load of rerolls. Even something like the Terminators, which I know is said aren't all that viable in Black Templars, this can make them a lot better. If you've got some Terminators in a Crusader, they get out, disembark and charge, you can be giving them reroll hit rolls of 1 and reroll wound rolls of 1, which does make their power fists and even their shooting before they charge in much more reliable into a variety of targets. So that is a really nice rule to have on the Crusader, and I kind of wish that the main Codex version had that, because I would be running that with my Deathwing all day long. And that is it for the Black Templars. Their new codex is very, very cool and very, very thematic. Whilst yes, they are smaller than some other factions in the game, you really do get a lot to play around with, and in my opinion you have some very fun, very powerful detachments to make use of. I really like the direction that GW took and the way they moved away from Oath of Moment as an army rule. I think that was a brilliant idea, and I hope they continue that for the other Marine factions, either in this edition or as we go into 11th. But I think it's a really good decision, and I think it's made the army feel different and feel more fun and exciting than perhaps some of the other Marine chapters. As always though, I'd love to know what you think, what your thoughts are on the Codex, and also how the Templars have been performing for you in game so far. I know they've been out a couple of months, this is a slightly delayed review that I've done, but I'd love to know how they have been performing for you in your games. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later guys.